Hello, welcome to Freedom Declared Foundation's latest interview about the state of freedom of religion or belief within the United Kingdom. My name is James Bundy, and I am delighted to be joined today by Georgia Gilholy. Georgia has volunteered as Editor-in-Chief for the Foundation for Uyghur Freedom, an organisation founded in September 2020 for the purpose of raising awareness of the Uyghur genocide amongst the British public. Georgia also works full-time as a journalist, and her main writing interests of foreign affairs, particularly in relation to the Middle East, China, and human rights issues. Thank you for joining us today, Georgia.
Thanks for inviting me, James.
The first question that we ask everyone is, how do you define freedom of religion or belief?
Yeah, I suppose aside from kind of the complex, maybe legal definitions, both domestic and international, the idea of freedom of religion and freedom of belief is really what it says on the tin. It's the freedom to profess your moral beliefs on various issues, or lack thereof. Obviously, some people are neutral on certain things, on certain big moral questions. It's about sort of having the liberty to believe it. Just think about it. It's having the freedom to express it. It's having the freedom to practice it in certain ways. Obviously, most religions involve sort of rituals or speaking about given issues, or maybe trying to persuade other people or convert them. That's what it's about, really. The only thing I would say is that kind of the obvious catch with that is that certain confessions or certain moral frameworks that people are free to believe, obviously, they conflict with other people's religious liberties, or liberties to not be religious at all.
Yes, no, that's interesting. And that form of coercion is also the right not to be coerced into a religious belief is also part of Article 18 of the UN Declaration. How well do you think the United Kingdom is currently doing in upholding your definition of freedom of religion or belief?
I would say not all that well, but however, I think sort of we do have to stop and think that we're very lucky in comparison to a lot of other places on the earth. I think it's over 60% of people, if I'm right. I think it's Open Doors who did this research a few years ago. But I believe they do a report every year. Sort of about 60% of people, the worldwide population, live in countries where freedom of religion or freedom of belief, or both really, are heavily compromised. Places like China, India, the Middle East, etc. So I think we are lucky. However, obviously, if you look around you in the UK, for decades, there have been many such cases of the government compromising people's ability to display or profess their religion. People have faced legal cases for, let's say, wearing a cross if they're working for an airline, which is, the thing is, I mean, that kind of thing is ridiculous to most people, obviously, but it doesn't really matter that it's ridiculous to most people, because most people are getting on with their everyday lives. They're not paying attention necessarily to cases like this. They're not involved in the justice system or making laws. And these kind of issues, well, like I'm saying, most people probably agree with us on them, that those kind of things are quite silly and dangerous. In fact, they're not necessarily going to be, I don't know, chaining themselves to the gates of the Palace of Westminster to try and stop it. So it's a usual case of the shoutiest majority, or a very select intellectual elite who spread certain ideas, allow them to infiltrate and compromise our freedoms.
Do you have any other examples? So you mentioned wearing a cross on an airline. Do you have any other examples?
I think a few famous examples of that kind of thing are, I believe there was a hotel in Brighton, I think it was in Brighton at least, a Christian couple running a hotel saying, no offense, but anyone can stay here, but we will not allow, I think it was gay couples to spend the night together. And I believe that they face legal backlash, and obviously backlash from the public, because it was spread in the media. There was a couple who didn't want a married gay couple to view their house in Surrey, I think it was. This was literally months ago, or even days ago maybe. And they're facing a legal case. Similar things like that. Obviously, the famous should they have to bake the gay wedding cake thing, which happened in Northern Ireland and it happened in America first. Those kind of incidents. But I think, the main thing that people forget about is, okay, maybe not forget about, but they don't really characterize it as one of the biggest sort of encroachments on religious liberty, because it was sort of a general thing, is obviously the coronavirus lockdowns everywhere, but in the UK as well. It's really shocking to think that people were stopped from attending churches, synagogues, mosques, other places of worship, completely banned from them. And actually many of those religious leaders, in some cases, documents have revealed that some of them actually lobbied for this. The government actually, in some cases, were probably willing to maybe be a bit laxer than they ended up being. We had church doors, synagogue doors shut, locked for months and months and months, at a time when people were confused about the state of the world, confused about the moral direction, many people lonely, stuck in their houses. And I think it's very disappointing that that was allowed to happen. And like I'm saying, it wasn't, in the UK at least, it wasn't just a straight cut case of the government forcing them to do this. Many of the religious leaders were involved in helping this happen, while their flocks were against it and sort of crying out to be allowed to return to the places where they go, every day, every week in some cases.
And the consequences of those COVID restrictions are still felt in Scotland. You can go to a pub or a nightclub without a face mask, but if you want to go to a church or a synagogue or a mosque, you have to wear a face mask. That's still the rules. So yeah, the double standards, I still are trying to get my head around them. One thing
I think one lingering, one of the lingering impacts in the UK that I think we're going to see and hear a lot more about is the impact on Church of England parishes. I'm sure you've seen the Save the Parish campaign. And the reason that, obviously this was an issue before with funding and attendance, especially in rural parishes. However, this is something that's really come to the forefront following the pandemic, because there's hundreds of thousands of these churches littered around England, these beautiful old churches, places where there was historic communities, and people who were maybe in the habit of going maybe every week, every month, maybe donating to the upkeep because they're struggling sort of buildings and communities, just got out of the habit of it, because maybe these people aren't particularly religious, or they don't feel at least that they need to maintain their spirituality by attending a physical location. And so we have these grassroots organizations fighting to keep these places open, these places that are just very important parts of our history, and they were part of our present. If they will continue to be, who knows?
Yes, a very worrying trend. And I've seen the figures that the Save the Parishes have put up, and it's a lot of churches that face closure in England if the current attendance and fundraising stay at the level that they are just now. One thing that I'm interested to ask about is, why did you get involved with the Foundation for Uyghur Freedom?
So the answer to that is actually quite simple. So I've always been interested, or I guess kept an eye on international news, especially concerning human rights. It's just something that I've been interested in since I was a teenager. It's preoccupied me. However, with the Foundation for Uyghur Freedom, I'd obviously heard about the issue before. I think the time that it was bubbling around on Twitter and in the news, however, it wasn't really being reported on, but I think that it was in 2018 or 2019, there was a BBC Radio 4, it's a program just called The Documentary, and a journalist at the BBC, she investigated this, she spoke to people, she listened to people's testimonies, people who had left the camps or been there. I can't recall whether she actually managed to visit Xinjiang herself, or she spoke to people who had been there, but it became quite apparent that this issue there was a lot more going on than what it seemed, if you were to just check, the front page of the Times or the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever every single day, the mainstream media, because they weren't really talking about it. And I think that with the pandemic, there was a lot more, the focus on China and skepticism of China's political system kind of came to the surface a lot more because Western populations and Western governments were realizing the potential that it had to impact them. It sounds cynical, but reality, that's the way it is when it comes to international relations. And in terms of the foundation, my friend from university had the idea, and she sort of asked if anyone wanted to be involved. And I said, yeah, absolutely. I've heard about this and I'm happy to contribute. So yeah, and thankfully other people have got involved since then. And I hope that we've at least been able to make some contribution to informing people about this issue. I know that a lot of people personally around me who maybe, previously couldn't even point out China on a map or Xinjiang, let alone Xinjiang, they know about this issue. And it's something that probably when people mention China's politics in an everyday conversation, maybe they'll mention that because I or my friend maybe have written something about it or shared something about it. So obviously we can only do so much as a small group of people, as with other such groups like us, many of which there are in the UK. But I hope at least that it raises awareness, builds some kind of pressure.
How do you think the UK government is responding to the situation in Xinjiang?
If they're responding at all, it's terribly. So in terms of actual concrete action, nothing's really happened yet. So last year, Dominic Raab, obviously then Foreign Secretary, now Justice Secretary, realistically, that demotion happened because of his terrible handling of the Afghanistan crisis. But let's not get into that. Or maybe let's get into that, maybe later. He essentially vowed to crack down on firms that were complicit in forced labor in Xinjiang, which we don't know the exact figures, obviously. We know sort of approximately, it's basically at least 1 million people or more in Xinjiang, but let's remember that forced labor is a huge issue around the world and also in the rest of China, so it's not just in Xinjiang. However, so he vowed to crack down on them. There was another announcement, I believe actually last week, once again, that sort of reiterating that, obviously not from Dominic Raab because he's no Foreign Secretary, but I think it was just from the Foreign Office. We're yet to really see how that is actually going to be implemented, so I'm skeptical. My skepticism isn't helped by the fact that a leak a few weeks ago reveals that the government awarded 4.9 billion, I believe, in government contracts to PP firms in China that are complicit in forced labor in Xinjiang. So while I understand there's some kind of recognition from the government that action needs to be taken, it's hard to see how that will happen when the government itself, the UK government, is complicit in it and continues to be. In terms of other such routes to helping the situation, there are some NGOs who obviously help with refugees and relocating them, not mainly in Britain or in Europe, more sort of in those Turkic speaking nations where Uyghur people may feel more culturally attuned. However, given the sort of vast power of the Chinese state, essentially what's happening is these people who have managed, thank goodness, to get out of the immediate danger in Xinjiang, many of them have had to leave their families behind. I've spoken personally to people who they've not heard from their family in a few years. They don't know what's happened to them. There are other people who they have family members who phone them and they're essentially being threatened by the Chinese government to tell them to, let's say, not speak about the issues happening there. And there are people who, let's say they and their family or most of their family have managed to leave. They're being monitored, they're being threatened abroad still. And like I said, with most of these people, it's their family, friends who are being threatened still back home, unfortunately. So they're not out of it. And really would you still wouldn't feel out of it, even if, let's say, you and your entire family, friends, which is unrealistic because that whole unit, your whole life wouldn't be able to get out right. Most people, that's not the case. You're still thinking about, this is happening to the place that I grew up, that I'm from. Is it even going to survive as a culture, my extended family, whatever? So even for people who managed to get out, the trauma is still there and it's still happening. And it's also the trauma of realizing that realistically, one, what are Western governments or NGOs going to do to help the situation? They're not doing much. Who knows if they'll do more? And second, what are those actions taken? What actions taken can actually put an end to this? Because I don't see that the Chinese government, from their record on this and other issues, are open to persuasion. And we know that from decades of sort of thinking, oh, well, if their economy is a bit more liberated, then surely they'll become democratic. We know that that's not the case. So there's no simple route to seeing how this is going to play out, apart from the most tragic way, the destruction of the Uyghur culture and their history, and also the killing and the gross human rights violations of many of those people, which is happening right now, obviously.
Yeah, it is tragic what's happening in Xinjiang, and hopefully Western governments can do something and start doing whatever that is. But there's no simple answer. Going for
like I said, the first thing is to try and end our complicity, and also that would have an economic impact on the Chinese government, because our complicity is an economic one, and also sanctions. I think a handful of people who we know are involved in these abuses are sanctioned, and we're basically, I say we, I mean obviously the British government, are refusing to sanction more of them because we're afraid of the reaction. But obviously it's not appropriate for us to be having relationships with those people.
Yes, and Mayinsky sanctions have been talked about, but the extending of them, there seems to be some hesitancy about doing that. On a broader scale, how do you think the UK government does in championing freedom of religion or belief globally?
Interesting question. I mean, obviously we do still provide a lot of international aid, and that's obviously not just through government funding, it's through NGOs, but obviously a lot of NGOs basically get huge grants from the British government. I think many of them do brilliant things. They help they help people leave places where they're being abused, to freer locations. They help provide food, water, etc. from people trying to escape those situations. You have certain NGOs who they don't necessarily do help on the ground. They might sort of try and influence media or whatever in certain countries to try and free up the situation. However, I would say that in general, the impact that we have isn't great. And I think that sometimes, obviously, because we're British people or we're people who've grown up in the West, we have a certain mindset. But looking from the outside, because when you're dealing with these things, you do have to look from the outside and think, how does this look? If you're looking from the outside and you see the British government, in many cases, like I say, discriminating against religious practices, infringing on people's freedom within the UK, obviously to not the same extent as, say, the CCP or ISIS, for goodness sake, obviously, I'm not saying that. But if you see that, and then you see them trying to promote religious freedom abroad, you think, well, what's the logic here? Is it sort of one rule for you, one rule for us? Why is that so? So I think that there needs to be a consistent approach. There isn't one. And I fail to see how one is going to happen, because not just with this certain government, many governments before them, they have a very haphazard approach to these things. And I think it's because we no longer have sort of, let's say, a normative majority consensus on certain moral issues, even including freedom of religious belief. It seems to be that we say things like, oh, of course, everyone has a right to believe whatever, or of course, everyone has a right to opinion. But then if someone's opinion you don't like, okay, let's sue them. Those two things obviously do not add up. And I think that especially when it comes to, an elected government in a representative democracy like the one where we live, I think that governments, they can be very scared about defending certain principles because they're worried about losing votes, or they're worried about being called out by certain sections of the media or whatever. And I think that they do bear responsibility for that, whatever they think personally, because they're ultimately the ones who have the most control when it comes to these things.
It was interesting what you were saying at the start of your answer there about the freedom of religion or belief infringements in the UK undermining the UK's efforts globally to champion freedom of religion or belief. So do you think that if the UK took defending freedom of religion or belief seriously domestically, it would strengthen the UK's efforts globally?
I think it depends. I think that having a consistent approach domestically, I don't think it magically solves those issues globally. And of course, the UK realistically doesn't have the power. No country has the power to, click their fingers or, give a bit of money to whatever project, and suddenly everyone believes in freedom of religious belief, and suddenly the world's a better place. That's not going to happen. However, I think that it would be a start, and I think that also, not just in terms of the optics of it, I'm speaking about as well the mindset of the people who are the policymakers, because it's hard to imagine that some of these people making the decisions, like I'm saying, the conflicting decisions, or at least being complicit in these conflicting decisions, because obviously, if you're a foreign minister, you're not necessarily making decisions about, let's say, trying to ban certain conversion practices that involve praying or whatever. You're obviously not involved in those decisions, but realistically, if you're a cabinet minister, you're not going to be speaking up against what your colleague's doing. You're not going to quit because of it. So it's hard to see that people in that mindset who are governing us and governing our international commitments are actually willing to really, I guess, really push for these things, if that makes sense. Because you can clearly see if this is their approach, they're obviously not prioritizing it. It's not a big deal to them. It's just sort of, we'll do this because, we need to spend this amount of foreign aid money in this place on this issue, whatever. And we're going to do this at home because it seems progressive and modern, whatever.
Yes, one thing that you have wrote about in the media is anti-Semitism in the UK. Is this a growing problem, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's absolutely a growing problem. So it's something I've witnessed as well. I feel maybe getting worse as I've grown up. But in terms of, that's obviously anecdotally speaking, but in terms of the actual stats, so the Community Security Trust, which is obviously a Jewish charity in the UK, they sort of train people to provide security at Jewish events and communities, that kind of thing. But they also do research, and they do a report every year on anti-Semitism. And so their report that they published last month on anti-Semitic incidents from the year 2021, you could see an absolute spiraling of it, basically. And a lot of this is related with the spike that we saw last year in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because obviously it provides sort of, I'm trying to think of the word really, but it provides an outlet for people to express that anti-Semitism in a way that seems progressive or anti-colonial one. Obviously, it's no such thing. So unfortunately, that's something that we see spike a lot. If you recall, I think it was 2014, 2012, 2008. Those were all spikes in the conflict. And every single time we witnessed not just, nasty tweets about certain things, attacking Jewish individuals, etc. You see people being physically attacked all across Europe, across the US, Canada, etc. Jewish community buildings being vandalized. So yeah, unfortunately, it is a growing problem in the UK, but it's one that probably many people aren't aware of. And I think some of the people who are aware of it don't necessarily want to acknowledge that it is in many ways related to the nasty elements of progressive politics.
So how do we first recognise and address the anti-Semitism crisis in the UK? And the second step is, how do we actually tackle it and make it clear that it's totally wrong?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, obviously that's a very difficult thing to do, because there are many people who they maybe have never even met a Jewish person. So they're just sort of like, okay, whatever. They're not hostile. They're just they don't have an opinion, basically, which makes sense from their perspective. And then you have certain communities who maybe from places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, where you know, the vast majority of people might not think they're anti-Semitic, but if you look at Pew Institute surveys, they express anti-Semitic attitudes, unfortunately. And these are places where, you know, Mein Kampf is a bestseller. Politicians constantly perpetuate anti-Semitic tropes. Anti-Semitism is ingrained in their society, and that doesn't disappear when elements of that society are transplanted in another culture. And in fact, it's interesting that you see some generations in the UK who've come from these certain places where anti-Semitism is more prominent and overt. You actually see maybe their parents, grandparents come from a generation where they were beginning to become a bit more moderate and open, but some of the communities, unfortunately, preachers, etc., have been imported, or rather, people aren't imported. They have imported sort of these virulent Wahhabi and Salafist threads of Islam from Saudi Arabia, from North Africa, basically, let's say, more radical elements that became popular in the last half of the 20th century, that sort of that are more dangerous when it comes to promoting anti-Semitic ideas. So many of the younger people might be actually more radical than their parents, which is interesting because obviously we have this sort of linear view of progress and we think, you know, things will eventually get better. Well, that's not happening when it comes to this. And like I say, I mean, it makes sense because, you know, the idea of multiculturalism, it sometimes means, depending on how it's implemented, it sometimes means total compromise to every single belief as if they're all equal. Well, I'm sorry, being anti-Semitic is not, it's not an equal belief to not being anti-Semitic. But the problem is that this can be quite difficult to confront for people. And like I'm saying, when it comes to the way that this is exhibited, when it comes to coverage of the Arab-Israeli conflict, many people don't understand why some of the comments or some of the perspectives are anti-Jewish, inherently anti-Jewish. They don't understand why, and they just see people say, "Oh, it's anti-Semitic," and they just think, "Oh, you know, well, maybe they're just being too sensitive, etc." They think, for example, I've been involved in organizations that work on trying to implement the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism on campus. And so this definition, it gives examples of things that are anti-Semitic to help people understand why they might be. And so, for example, if your criticism of Israel involves comparing it to the Nazi genocide of 6 million Jews in 20th century Europe, this can be anti-Semitic because you're trying to sort of compare Israel, which is a society where many people are either Holocaust survivors or related to them. It's almost as if you believe that they're trying to inflict that upon Palestinian populations, which is not the case historically, not the case now. And also, let's say if you, another example would be saying that this is a common feature of anti-Zionist discourse on the left sometimes, and also in Islamist circles. And I think it was possibly something that was sometimes used in the Soviet Union, is the idea that you know, Israel was, people believe that the Holocaust, for example, was fabricated as an excuse to found Israel. And I think many people don't even understand, you know, the history of why Israel was created, what was created, where it was, the history of some of the compromises that were made, the fact that while things are certainly not perfect there by any stretch of the imagination, it is a place where you see Christians, Muslims, Jews in the Middle East living alongside with equal voting rights, equal human rights, thankfully. And also you have people living there who they might be from whatever ethnic background, but they're allowed to practice their beliefs. They're allowed to be whatever sexuality they want to be. It is somewhere you would prefer to live, basically, compared to, unfortunately, neighboring Lebanon was supposed to be sort of the example of a Christian state in the Middle East. But what basically happened is, because of demographics and because of the ideologies there, and let's think about now the terrible economic situation they're in, it essentially got taken over by Islamists. And that is what would happen to Israel if it sort of succumbed to some of these threats against it, which is unfortunate. And also, let's think about the Palestinians, many of which are Christians, most of them are practicing Muslims, however, living in the West Bank, living in Gaza, subjected to the most terrible abuses, being used as human shields, being subjected to gross human rights violations. This is not a good situation. However, blaming every single problem on Israel is not the solution. And this visceral hatred of anything associated with Israel, which, let's not forget, obviously, like 90% of world Jewry are Zionists. And also, I think there's a massive misconception about what a Zionist is, because the word Zionist to some people seems almost like a dirty word. All it means is that you think that Israel should exist, basically. It doesn't mean that you think it should have a right-wing government, a left-wing government. It doesn't mean that you think maybe there couldn't be a Palestinian state at some point, if that would be able to be achieved, which obviously it has been offered several times and it's been refused, unfortunately. And I think that I've probably gone on a tangent, but this is just an issue that I think many people, they misunderstand, and it's not about preventing criticism of Israel. That needs to happen. Israel's a state like any other. It needs to be subject to criticism when it does wrong. And also, of course, in Israel, it's a democracy. So people are always arguing about what the government does. There are more progressive people. There are more right-wing people. There are more religious people. There are more secular people. That's how it goes in any democracy. But I think what we need to think about is, are we sometimes basically kowtowing to a lot of misconceptions for the sake of not wanting to criticize other cultures sometimes, and for the sake of not wanting to criticize people who might present themselves as progressive, someone like Jeremy Corbyn, for example, who thankfully might be expelled from Labour soon, so maybe we won't have to talk about him.
Yeah, so it's a lack of understanding or not knowing anything about the situation. Do you think that's the cause of it, or amongst the majority of the British population? You were talking about there's obviously an element that do know through their culture. They know details of the story and they're presenting their beliefs. And is it tapping into people's naivety about the situation?
I think yes and no. I think, yeah, maybe with the average British person, let's say if someone who has that more radical perspective on it that often spills over into anti-Semitism, maybe they could be sort of, I don't know, get misconceptions from speaking with that person. But I think most people in the UK, the vast majority of them, they just have absolutely no contact with that experience, whether it be on the Palestinian side or the Israeli side, or the experience of diasporas abroad that have to deal with the impact of it. I think they just have no contact with that whatsoever. They see bits in the news about it, and that's as far as it goes. And obviously, that's not going to be a major issue when it comes to voting. So, for example, if you're just the average Labour voter, you might not be too plugged in. You're just someone who thinks, oh, well, I'll vote Labour. And it's the same with many Conservative voters, of course, too. But I'm saying this specifically in relation to Jeremy Corbyn. And they would maybe have just voted for him. It doesn't mean that they're anti-Semitic. It doesn't mean that they agree with everything Jeremy Corbyn has said or done, or people he's laid wreaths with or laid wreaths for. It just means that they're not really aware of the connections, and probably they wouldn't be aware of maybe his impact on the Jewish community's fears, etc., before it's too late. So I wouldn't necessarily say, I think vast majority of British people are not hostile to Jewish communities, and I think that luckily the UK it still remains one of the best places in the world for those communities and also for other religious communities. But I think the problem is that, yeah, to an extent there's not an understanding, but also you can kind of understand why there isn't, because those things don't impact people directly. But that's the case with obviously many such issues, unfortunately. And the problem is that people who might know more, or people who are in the political or the intellectual elites, they facilitate these things sometimes deliberately.
So if people, the majority of British people aren't directly impacted by events in Israel and Palestine, how does the UK go about tackling the anti-Semitism in the UK that spikes when events kick off?
Yeah, I think one thing is it would be interesting, and this is not just the case for the Arab-Israeli conflict or for anti-Semitism, is I think we do need a more robust education system when it comes to world history, European history, history in general. I think, I don't know about you, but with my education, I mean, I actually studied history at university, but when I did GCSE and A-level, and to an extent as well at university, essentially what happens is you study kind of random bits of history, Henry VIII, World War II, don't really understand like the big themes or the big narratives leading up to them. I don't think we're really given that nowadays. And I'm not saying this because I want history to be you know, hugely politicized. I have my own views, but I think that what needs to happen is people are given a greater understanding, and then hopefully they'll come to the right conclusions about certain things. But also, I think, as with many of these issues, unfortunately, it's been left to sort of community leaders in the Jewish community and other communities to sort of try and campaign on this. And I hope that, and I hope I contribute to that too, by writing about some of these things, to sort of help people understand. But like I'm saying, I mean, it's never going to be an issue that decides most people's votes. So it's something that sort of you have to just keep pushing for. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see, I guess, what happens in the next 10 years. Yeah, because I think in many places in Europe, we see Jewish communities growing in terms of population levels because many of the ultra-Orthodox communities have quite high birth rates. However, if you look at other elements of the community, many people are leaving for, as I say, obvious reasons, because they don't feel welcome anymore.
Yeah, no, that will be interesting. And your point on education, I also think that there has to be a focus on British history as well as European and global history, because brought up in Scotland, we never got taught about the 16th or 17th century. So the Scottish Reformation, the English Reformation, or the Stuart monarchy, there was no context to that, and that obviously provides a lot of context to the treatment towards Catholicism, non-conforming Protestants. So the tension that steeps in our history wasn't taught in our school. So if we don't do a good enough job teaching that, how are we going to do a good enough job teaching European and global history?
Totally agree.
One thing I wanted to get your opinion on was you talked about we live in a democracy. We claim that you can have your free opinion, but then if you give an unpopular opinion, you'll get sued or you'll get cancelled. How do we change that culture in Britain?
Oh, wow. Okay. I might need to think about that one. Like I'm saying, I think one of the main issues, or at least a big issue, is education. I think people, you know, something like a third of children thought that the Battle of Waterloo happened in the First World War. I think this was a survey from like 2014 or something, so a few years ago, but I'm struggling from what I've seen at British schools and having left one not that many years ago. I'm struggling to imagine that would have got better. I think we need to really go back to basics when it comes to education. We need to be installing a rigorous narrative history in children. I think we need to be focusing on improving literacy, improving numeracy. I say that as someone who is crap at maths. We need to kind of install the idea that achievement is okay, achievement is good, but also providing good routes for people who they might be, you know, a very practical person, but they're not necessarily interested in going to university. We need to make sure there are routes for those people too. There needs to be options for everyone, basically. And I think what we're doing now is quite sort of muddled in schools, and we don't really provide either route very well at all, compared to, for example, even you know, our European cousins. And so I think we need to go back to basics when it comes to that, because you can't really try and improve a general culture if people aren't even being educated properly. And I think that, yeah, sometimes we are seeing politicization in schools when it comes to these things. Oh, sorry, can you hear that? It's like a beeping on my computer.
No.
Oh, I think it's yeah, it was probably the Chinese government spying on me, like they usually do. Yeah. Where was I don't know, actually.
You said
So yeah, we need to make sure that people are getting a decent education so they can at least have a starting point for trying to come into contact with the world. I think with many of these arguments, that say the argument that, I don't know, someone should lose their reputation if they have a Christian view on abortion or marriage or whatever. I think the problem is that whereas most people, everyday people previously, they're not too fussed, and obviously that's the thing decades ago, most people had a Christian view on marriage, abortion, etc., those kind of moral issues. I think that the problem is that radical ideas on wanting to silence those people or cancel those people, they've been filtered gradually over decades through aspects of the media, through universities. So essentially those sort of cloistered elites, the intelligentsia, etc., whatever you want to call them, not in a conspiratorial way, because I think it's quite open to see, and I'm not saying that these people are magically controlling things, because I think it's just things that are being presented in the media, and they become more popular. I think it's as straightforward as that. And I think that people who believe in freedom of expression need to be making better arguments. They need to be informed on the history of rights, the history of philosophy, the history of religion, and when these things have worked, when they haven't, where even human rights come from. Let's think about where human rights come from. Well, first of all, human rights as we think of them automatically as Western people, it's a Western idea, which means that it comes from the Bible, it comes from Christian civilization in medieval Europe. It emerges from the idea that we all have equal dignity because we have equal and immortal souls. This is a profoundly radical idea in the history of human beings. Before biblical religions, this was just not an idea. You know, in ancient Greece and Rome, for example, which there are periods in time that many conservatives actually fetishize to an extent. The idea of your honor and dignity came from your status in society. It came from your wealth. It came from how you could perform as a warrior, for example. It wasn't a given that you had inherent rights, inherent dignity. That's something that we take for granted. Thankfully, I'm glad we took it for granted because I believe in it. However, we need to understand better where they came from, these ideas. Otherwise, how can we hope to defend them if many people on the right and the left who want to defend these things, often they reply quite lazily. They just say, oh, you know, look at these crazy people promoting cancel culture, these woke people, as if this woke thing is something that is, I don't know, it just appeared out of nowhere. It's a catch-all term, woke, to describe some of the responses to ideas of universal rights, including freedom of expression, that's been brewing for centuries. And I think that people don't understand why it exists and what it's a reaction to, where it came from, and they don't understand why they actually believe what they do about freedom of expression. It's just sort of, oh, let me tweet that, I don't know, these crazy left-wing people have done something. They don't actually seem to understand the history of why maybe that might be wrong. So how can they hope to defend it? I think we need to be making sure that children get a decent education. And also, we need to be better promoting things like family stability and being able to make a decent living, which might seem a bit random when we're talking about freedom of expression, but you need to have those stable things in a society so that people are coming from a stable place to encounter the world. Otherwise, how can they hope to encounter things in a sensible way? But also, as I said, on an individual point, if you're someone who wants to defend, let's say, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, it can't just be about having like a Twitter moment and saying, oh, look at these crazy people. You actually need to understand why you actually think what you do. Or maybe you don't think what you do. Maybe you're just saying it so you can get retweets, which I think is unfortunately the case with some people.
Do you think there's a resignation feeling amongst people who defend freedom of speech, freedom of expression, that it's on the way out?
That's probably the reason why.
One thing that you also mentioned was the mindset and priority of government officials. How do you think we can go about in our daily lives trying to change the attitude of MPs, of the Foreign Office, and because looking at this domestically, local government departments as well?
The problem is, I suppose one idea would be trying to get involved yourself, but I'm saying that in a hypocritical way, really, because I have I don't want to be involved in politics. Like, I wouldn't want to be an MP or a councillor or a civil servant. I just don't think that's something that I would be able to do, or I would want to suffer through, basically. So I think that we do need leadership in those areas. Obviously, not everyone, like I said, it's not something I would want to do. We do, however, I think probably need better people to put themselves forward for those kind of things. However, like I said, we need to make sure that we're making better arguments and we're educating ourselves and we're defending our ideas to the best ability that we can. However, I think that, as I was saying before, it's a structural issue. And let's say, for example, the Foreign Office. Back in the day, the Foreign Office had a very rigorous application process. People had to at least speak one other language to work there, I believe. You had to have some kind of background or expertise in foreign relations and international affairs. But nowadays, through certain recruitment ways of recruitment for the civil service, for junior positions and high-level positions, for example, being a foreign secretary, you don't need those things. And I think it just sort of becomes another sort of job. Oh, I'm sending emails. And, you know, plenty of people who work there probably learn an immense amount while they're there, even if they didn't necessarily come into it with the best qualifications. But I think that to try and promote excellence, you need to have those standards. And probably one of the reasons why those standards are slipping when it comes to Whitehall and MPs, however, is just because in general, as a society, our educational standards have slipped. You see it with university applications as well. They accept, so for example, if you're in the bottom 15% of schools, which I was, you are offered lower grade requirements for the course you apply for at university, even if it's, you know, like a Russell Group university. And it's because obviously they want to help people who come from more disadvantaged backgrounds get into university, you know, being able to be in that position where they can achieve a degree from a good university and try and get a better job, better themselves, etc. However, while it helps people like me, in the long term, it doesn't, because what you're doing is you're allowing the general situation to decline, because you're just allowing the standards to slip. You're not saying, okay, why are people not achieving as well from these schools? Is it because of the funding? Is it because of the attitudes or the curriculums or whatever? I think probably a combination of both. So we need to solve that so that everyone can at least have the opportunity to be on a level playing field to an extent. Obviously, not everyone's going to go to Eton, but the problem is you need to be providing, in general, most people with the option to be able to achieve similar things. that's not happening, and that's why standards are slipping, whether it be universities or civil service. And so, like I said before, I feel like I'm a broken record, but if you're allowing that in general, how can you hope specific areas or people who want to be rigorous in their approach to things to apply for those jobs? Most people I know who got a first-class degree, who are in my class at university or wherever, they're going into finance, they're going into corporate law because they know that's the only place where they feel they might be challenged, or they feel they might be able to make a decent living. Let's not forget as well, jobs in the civil service and trying to get into politics, for example, they tend to be not as well paid, which can be a good thing, definitely a good thing. I don't think you should be getting into wanting to be an MP because you're going to make money. But unfortunately, as we've seen with some of the people who are paid lobbyists, for example, that might be one of the reasons why they get involved. If it isn't the reason why they get involved, I suspect that it helps. So yeah, I think we need to be doing the best we can in our given fields. I hope that I'm doing some decent work as a journalist or an opinion writer. I try to, but there's only so much you can do. But the problem, as I say, is a structural one. And also, let's not forget, the vast majority of people promoting freedom of religion in the UK and abroad, it's not a priority for them. So the people who, for is it a priority, like you and I, we need to do the best that we can.
Mm-hmm. And the final question that I ask everyone is, how do we just improve the implementation of freedom of religion or belief in the UK? We've covered quite a bit of that already, with education, getting involved either through journalism or politics or the charity that we've set up, so we can actually spend that time to prioritize that question. Is there anything else that the UK should be doing?
I think when it comes to individuals, as you're saying, try and do the best we can. If we're a better communicator, maybe try and write, try and speak about these things. If we're not, share the work of your organizations, other organizations who do similar things, which I also try and do, obviously. So trying to sort of raise awareness. But obviously the issue with raising awareness is it can only do so much. You can be aware of something and be complacent about it, or actually be hostile to it. So I think, like I said, anecdotally speaking, I've had a lot of success with people I know personally, persuading them on these issues. So I think trying to stick your neck out in a personal situation is a good start, because I think it can actually sometimes be difficult for people to have those conversations with people who they might be friends or members of their family, because you don't necessarily want to create discord, let's say, in a given conversation, or at a, I don't know, your grandma's birthday party. But I think that, you know, it's our duty really to do that. On a wider level, like I said, it's very difficult because a lot of these issues are structural. However, I suppose when it comes to campaigning, maybe trying to help with that. The problem is that when it comes to political campaigning or voting, I mean, let's be frank about this, as we've discussed, neither of the main two political parties in the UK prioritise this issue. So I suppose it's makes sense that we would try and pressure them on that. If you work, I don't know, in lobbying, try and lobby them on that. But when it comes to those things, it's it's quite depressing, because there's only so much you can do, and it doesn't seem like this is a major issue for most people, unless it affects them.
Well, yes, and I think that's what we're trying to do at Freedom Declared Foundation, to raise this awareness, but also have that form of education. We've got a report on Magna Carta, freedom of religion or belief in the UK since Magna Carta to the present day. So we're looking at all the different legal aspects and societal aspects that have kicked off. We're doing these interviews and many more projects down the line to help.
I hope you interview David Starkey on the dissolution of the monasteries or something. I think that would be fun.
I'll take a note of that.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for your time, Georgia, and also thank you for the work that you're doing for the Foundation for Uyghur Freedom and your journalism and writing about all these infringements on freedom of religion or belief. I'll put the link to the foundation on the YouTube video, so if people watching go and click on it and see what the foundation is up to. At that bit in the video, you'll also see the link to Freedom Declared's social media accounts. And if you want to stay up to date with these interviews, please hit the subscribe button on the YouTube channel. So thank you again, Georgia, for your time. And yeah, thanks for watching.